We ended the last video by defining God as being. Many people approach this topic in a wrong way, claiming that the argument for motion only proves some kind of generic God. It is clear, however, that God cannot be anything more than being. Remember what the Catholic Encyclopedia states. Finite beings are defined by their essence. God can be defined only by being. Pure and simple, nothing less and nothing more. In order for God to be more than just being, God would have to have multiple parts. For example, personality and being. It was demonstrated in the first video, however, that the whole depends on its parts for its existence, and God, as the first principle, cannot depend on anything for his existence. Furthermore, whatever is made of parts is potentially divided or whole, but it was demonstrated previously that God cannot be potential in any way. In other words, God cannot be composed of parts because that would imply something is prior to the first cause. So it is clear that God is not in any way composite. So we cannot say that God has additional attributes like personality, magic, being in the sky, etc. All that we can say is that God can be defined only by being, pure and simple, nothing less and nothing more. You might be wondering, how do I get to the loving God of Christianity? If God is only defined as being, then this doesn't sound much like the traditional understanding of God. In reality, Christianity is much more complicated than that. Let me quote St. Thomas Aquinas to demonstrate this. Since our intellect is unable to grasp his essence as it is in itself, we rise to a knowledge of that essence from the things that surround us. Various perfections are discerned in these things, the root and origin of them all being one in God, as has been shown. Since we cannot name an object except as we understand it, for names are signs of things understood, we cannot give names to God except in terms of perfections perceived in other things that have their origin in Him. And since these perfections are multiple in such things, we must assign many names to God. If we saw His essence as it is in itself, a multiplicity of names would not be required. Our idea of it would be simple, just as His essence is simple. In other words, we can only define God through things we have directly experienced, and since we have not yet experienced God, we cannot truly define God except through God's effects. This is ultimately founded on an idea of the principle of proportionate causality, which was discussed in the first video. The basic idea is that whatever is in the effect pre-exists in the cause. So because God is the first cause of things insofar as they are actual, we can speak of God as containing that actuality which exists in things, but in a unified way in God. This sounds very difficult to comprehend, but let me try to break this down for you. What exactly is it that distinguishes an on light bulb, for example, from an off light bulb? Well, one distinction is that an on light bulb has electricity flowing through it, and an off light bulb does not. A light bulb is also distinguished from other things like ice cubes by the lack of water, among other things. What you'll notice, if you really think about it, is that a thing is distinguished from another by the fact that it lacks some form of actuality another has. Remember that it was demonstrated that God is pure act. In other words, God contains actuality without any potentiality. The actuality that exists in an off light bulb, an on light bulb, and an ice cube, etc., also pre-exist in God. All things that exist pre-exist in God because God is the cause of their existence, but without any potentiality. What does this mean? You might think this would be a form of some massive, complex confusion of things, all things in the universe, in fact. But remember that distinction in things is caused by there being a lack of actuality in things. Distinction in things is formed by the very limited nature, by lacking some form of actuality. God cannot lack any form of actuality because that would mean God is potential with respect to that form of actuality, which would mean God is not pure act. Without any lack of actuality, there can be no distinction in God. Without distinction, what you have is just being, pure and simple, nothing less and nothing more. As the Catholic Encyclopedia states, this is also what the Catechism means when it states, God is the fullness of being. One way you can think of this is as putting all of the possible forms of actuality spaced in the infinite universe and then squeezing it down into an undifferentiated infinitesimal point. There you are coming close to an idea of God, but obviously when we can never perfectly conceptualize that reality of God because we have never experienced it. So this is how we speak of God. We speak of God as having all of the perfections of things, but while understanding that this is in God in a unified way. From this we can determine other things, like the fact that there cannot be a multiplicity of gods of pure act. In order for two things to be different, they must differ in some way. That is, one God must have something that the other God lacks to differentiate it, such as location in space or a benevolent will. Since God is in no way composite, there is no part of God that one God could lack and the other have. Hence, there cannot be multiple gods. As Saint Augustine said, there is accordingly a good which is alone simple, and therefore alone unchangeable, and this is God. By this good have all others been created, but not simple, and therefore not unchangeable. We can also speak of God by way of negation. As we said, God is eternal, but by that we simply mean that there is no beginning or end of his existence. By negation, we speak of this. In the same way, we can say that God is immaterial. God cannot be in any way material since material things are extended in space and divisible. Also, anything in space is potentially movable, and God is not mobile. God must also be infinite, in the sense that there is no limit to God's actuality, because of the very fact that God is not in any way potential. Now, naturally, many of you are thinking right now, I thought God was intelligent. I thought God was good. If God is just being, then how is he any of these other things? I am not denying that God is these things per se, but God is not these things in a composite way. Just think about what we have learned about God thus far. God's essence is existence. God cannot change. God is eternal. God is immobile. All of these facts about God are not differentiated parts of God, but simply imperfect ways of describing being itself. This is the way in which I will continue to demonstrate that God has the traditional properties attributed to God. Furthermore, it is important to realize that in some cases we have to be careful about how God is interpreted in the scriptures. As Eusebius of Caesarea said, now you may find that in Hebrew scriptures also thousands of such passages concerning God, as though he were jealous, or sleeping, or angry, or subject to any other human passions, which passages are adopted for the benefit of those who need this mode of instruction. The issue with the scriptures is that you have to consider who the audience is. The audience of the Bible was not experts in Aristotelian metaphysics. In fact, these books were written long before Aristotle and are addressed to a larger audience than just experts. We always have to consider the audience. So I work in evolutionary biology, for example. When I speak about my work in evolutionary biology to people not familiar with the nuances of the field, I'm not going to tell them I am performing a quantitative trait loci analysis using Illumina sequencing. I'm going to use much simpler languages which might not be entirely correct. I mean, you certainly cannot repeat my experiments based on the language I would use, but this language will give my audience all that they want, just a general understanding of what I'm doing. The same goes for our understanding of God. The things that I'm going to explain to you is not something that the average person on the street will understand or even is interested in understanding. Hence, when speaking about God to laymen, we use language like God was angry, when what we would technically be saying in the metaphysical sense is much more complicated. So, if you want to understand the metaphysics, don't read the Bible on its own. The Bible simply was not written as a treatise on metaphysics. Read books like St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles. Incidentally, the same goes for science. If you want to understand how long ago the world was made and what process God used to create the world, don't read the Bible. Read a science textbook. The Bible is not a science textbook. You need to consider the audience. The Bible was written long before people were interested in science. And also the genre needs to be considered, which was typically classified as ancient poetry when it comes to Genesis. Anyway, I will go more into what the first cause is in the next video. Thanks for watching.